What's up guys, Intellitech Studios, and today we're going to be doing a video on the Hoover Air Cordless. Now this machine is just like the previous generation Hoover Air Steerable that I reviewed, although this machine, just like the Air Steerable, although much more quickly, was in fact discontinued, primarily because Hoover these days are moving on to their one power line of machines where they're trying to use the same type of battery for pretty much all of their cordless products, or at least all the ones that are compatible with a similar voltage. So this machine was axed in that sort of re-overhaul of TTI's cordless lineup, and unfortunately that means that TTI, or Hoover, no longer has a cordless bagless upright with tools, as the machine that replaced this is more so of a Lynx ripoff, or not really ripoff, I guess, of Lynx successor, and it's somewhere in between the sizes of the smaller Hoover Lynx and this Hoover Air Cordless, both of which have been discontinued, unfortunately. Hoover used these older generation lithium-life batteries, and they don't make a lot of parts for this machine anymore, unfortunately. So, as much as I'm going to sing the praises of this machine in many ways, you can't get it anymore. And that's just unfortunate, because this machine is actually really nice, and I prefer it greatly to the Hoover Air Steerable, not because this machine cleans better than the Hoover Air Steerable, but just because of the fact that the versatility of it is really great. And cordless uprights with tools are very hard to find now. The only one I'm even really aware of at this point is the Loop Pure Cordless, which I did review a while ago, but because it's from a relatively small company, trying to actually find them for a good price is pretty difficult these days. A lot of other options that we see, including from Hoover and Oreck, as well as Riccar, are all basically just Orex or Superlights with batteries stuffed on them. Which, don't get me wrong, it's a good idea, but not having a hose is a little bit annoying. So this, for a time, was a great all-in-one solution. Even if it was a little bit expensive, it still was cheaper than a lot of Dyson options that we found at the time. And something like a V8 or a V10 might have actually seemed like a worse option compared to something like this, since you had a more basic upright design. Now, the way that this machine works is actually kind of funny. So we've got a pretty standard base, again, very similar to what we find on the Hoover Air Steerable, and there were two different brush roll options for this machine. This particular one is the standard full stiff bristle brush roll, which actually works really well and does a surprising job at grooming the carpet, despite its relatively minimal size. The bristles are stiff enough that it actually does pretty decently, although the housing does sometimes pull on these bristles and deform them in a strange way. We've also got this front gate for the wind tunnel technology, which actually does great on bare floors. Most standard uprights that have just a brush roll that shuts off don't tend to do very well on bare floors, as they tend to struggle with large debris. The only real exception that I found was something like the Dyson Ball Animal 3. And this machine, it is very similar to that regard, where it has a gate on the front that allows larger debris to pass through if you get it close enough to the center that it sucks it in. And we do have center feed suction, and it actually does surprisingly well. Now, one thing that's a little strange, but that's kind of part of the way this is designed, is when we press the button to remove the bin, we're actually holding the motor in our hands, as the motor actually is in this top section. And there is no accessible post-motor filter or any form of HEPA filtration. So unfortunately, post-motor filtration on this does lack compared to the competition, especially these days, but we've got a standard dual cyclonic cassette, and we've got a filter inside of here that is relatively easy to wash. Just like a lot of other TTI machines, we twist this, and the filter is right there, and it is washable. And the entire dual cyclonic cassette can also break down if you get any smells in it, if you need to clean it out. Now, trying to get this with one hand is a little tricky, but it is possible. Now we've got his little trap door right there to allow us to empty out the debris, and we can see it actually does a pretty decent job at getting up some debris. Now down here we've got our hose, and unfortunately the little tabs that kind of guide the hose in place are fairly prone to breaking. As you can see, this one is snapped off, so I elected to remove those from the unit. But we've got a hose right down here, and we actually have to bend all the way down to the floor to remove the hose, as the hose is very short, but it is a stretch hose, so you actually can stretch it a fair bit. You can see this one's unfortunately a bit discolored, but it does still work. So we can grab this button right here and pull off our hose. And this attachment is kind of interesting because standard 1¼ attachments that you can get, this one's actually from a Dirt Devil because I misplaced the original attachments. A lot of these standard attachments surprisingly do fit on the end of this hose. And depending on the type of attachment, they can fit more snugly than others. So even though it looks a little strange, it is an 1¼ fitting, so certain attachments can fit on here. But there is also a wand. Now, the previous owner taped this for some reason, but you can press this button right here and pop out your wand, which is difficult to do with one hand. I might have to actually grab the tripod. But here we've got our wand. It's not very long, but it does allow us to take the attachments. Again, this is from a Dirt Devil, but you get the idea. And we can use this tab right here to click it onto the wand, very similar to what we find nowadays on like Abyssal Power Force Compact. And now we have a little bit of reach. And the nice thing about this is that even though the hose does twist a fair bit, which is kind of one of my complaints, it actually does do a decent job at getting a good amount of reach for a cordless machine. And because of how relatively lightweight it is, you can, of course, just pick the thing up because it's very lightweight. So cleaning with this is actually quite nice. Now, much like the sort of similarly sized Dyson DC-24 from another years ago, when this machine was new, it only came with a basic combination crevice tool dusting brush combo that was supposed to sort of be just a multi 3-in-1 tool. Now, of course, I don't have that tool, so this is just a random attachment I found, just so that way the peg isn't empty, and so it doesn't like break during shipping or anything like that. But you can, of course, fit 1¼ attachments like ones from older Dysons, but depending on what attachment you put on, it could fit better on the wand than on the hose, or vice versa. But of course, if you're like me, and you have a ton of Hoover attachments, then obviously those are going to fit just fine, since they're designed pretty well for that. So this thing, for stairs or for upholstery or anything like that, does a really good job. And of course, because the motor is all the way up here, while that means there's a little bit of weight on the handle when you're pushing and pulling the thing, because the motor is relatively small, sorry about the noise, but because the motor is relatively small, when you're actually holding it in your hands, you're holding pretty much all the weight in your hand. So it's actually not as bad as you would think. It still can get tiring after a while, just like any liftoff, and no liftoff is as good as a machine where you can just simply leave it and go wherever. But with the length of this hose, you can at least definitely get by with it, and trying to do couches or anything like that is certainly possible, both with and without the wand installed. So if I twist this, we can see, now this thing is kind of running out of battery, so I'll try to demo this really quickly. Excuse me, Rubes. But as we can see, if I want to do something like the couch, I absolutely can. Now, I wouldn't even bother trying a turbo on this. So, I mean, I can't vouch for how good it spins a turbo because, frankly, I never tried it. I just kind of assumed it wouldn't be good. Who knows? Maybe that was dumb. But we can show you. Now, the suction on this, as you'd expect for a relatively early cordless, is not that great, but it's plenty to get the job done, and I'd rather have slightly too little, like on this machine or on a Phantom or something like that, than something like a modern Dyson, which has a ridiculous amount of suction to the point where it's just annoying. So, I actually like the amount of suction that this has, as it's never really been an issue. And of course, when you're done, again, you have to bend down or pick up the machine, but you can clamp the hose down there. Now, I can only assume that maybe the reason why Hoover removed this hose on the newer machines is maybe they found that with the hose being stored the way it was, that people weren't using it. I'm not sure, but that's obviously just speculation. But at the end of the day, this thing actually does pretty okay. Obviously, it's not, under any circumstances, going to be a replacement for a plug-in machine, but if you can somehow find your hands on one of these, like the customer who bought this on eBay and who will get it shipped out to them tomorrow, well, not tomorrow as of this going up, but as of I film this, but then this thing actually would be a decent machine. But unfortunately, Hoover doesn't agree because they don't want you to have this, because it's not available anymore. which is really unfortunate because it's a great little machine. So we'll give it a relatively small demo real quick, and then we'll pretty much just be good. I mean, I know this is a very short video, but there's not really a lot to complain about. I mean, the handle has too much play, but given the fact that the state of the handle, I can't accurately comment on that as if it was a fault with the machine, because I don't know if that's a fault or if that's just simply the way it was designed. So who knows? So I can't really comment on that, and that's really my biggest complaint. My only other real complaint is that, and this is less prevalent on carpet where there's a bit of resistance, but it's really prevalent on bare floors. The swivel neck on this is ridiculously smooth, which is really good, don't get me wrong. It makes it easy to zip in and around corners and whatnot, but when you're on bare floors, it feels really floaty to the point where I feel like it's difficult to control and difficult to navigate it into tight spaces. But that's really my biggest complaint. Other than that, it works perfectly well. You've got the ability to shut off the brush roll, and like I said, I've got the stiff bristle brush, but there is technically another brush roll that's a combination soft and stiff roller, but that one is no longer available, and frankly both these brush rollers are getting difficult to find, hence why it took me so long to get a brush roll, because it cost me about 40 bucks, and I kept wanting to wait and find one in cheaper condition, and eventually I just bit the bullet and bought this one, because I wanted to get this machine up and running and get it. And to tell you the truth, I wanted to sell this before the battery died, basically. But despite this battery, you know, having only one bar left, I've never put it on that charger in the time that I pulled this out. This machine sat up in a closet upstairs for 4 years, and I don't even remember what the battery percentage was at when I put it in that, we'll just call it storage, even though it wasn't technically a storage unit. And when I pulled this out just to do the video on it last time, the last video that you saw on this, which was a couple days ago, I still have not charged it. This thing, yes, it's on one bar, but it's still on its charge that it was in whenever I put it in storage. Again, storage, I use the term very loosely. It's still in my house, however many years ago, and it's still got 2 bars. And I've been using it. You know, not using it, but I've used it in those videos. I've only used it like 1 or 2 times outside of the videos, and frankly, it was only for maybe a minute at a time. So I can't really comment on how long the battery lasts, because even if I did try to measure that, I can't really say for sure how accurate that would be compared to what it was when it was new. And obviously, a battery is one of those things where your exact variant will determine the battery life. So I don't want to comment on battery life because every battery wears differently. So that being said, we are going to give this a quick run. Now, it does sound like a pretty basic, crappy, old school, you know, cordless vacuum. It doesn't sound, it sounds more like an old school dustbuster than a modern Dyson. Let's put it that way. It's got that kind of metallic whir up and whir down sound. You'll see exactly what I mean when I run this. It sounds very old school. So again, it makes sense why Hoover discontinued this, but I would have loved to see Hoover re-engineer this with a much lighter digital motor and maybe with a slightly more updated design that's maybe a bit sturdier, or even just keep this around, frankly, because even in its current state, it's perfectly fine. Slap a nicer motor in it and, you know, a modern battery with better, more efficient cells, you know, because this thing's a decade old. Battery technologies has evolved greatly since 2014, and that's another crazy thing. The fact that this thing still holds a charge after a decade is pretty crazy. I don't remember if this was the original battery that came with it. That doesn't matter. I'll run it real quick. Now, one little thing I forgot to mention too is that there's actually two different versions of this machine. A lot of the ones that you'll see that were updated, around probably, I want to say 2015, 2016, or when they were updated somewhere around that range. There was an updated model of this that looks virtually identical, but has a slightly different model number and has a headlight that sits underneath where the battery goes. This is the older model that does not feature the headlight, so that the headlight isn't burnt out, it just doesn't exist on this model. And then there also was a newer version called the Hoover Air Cordless Lift, which technically the brush roll that I bought was designed for that model, but they're all interchangeable, thankfully. And that model was the very, very last version before it was all discontinued. I can't say for sure which version lasted the longest, but this one, I believe, is the oldest model, but I could be wrong on that. Mine was manufactured in 2014. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Of one of my shortest reviews ever, and that's because even though this is a more complex machine than a lot of the corded uprights that I've reviewed, this one by far has been the most simple to review because it just simply does everything that it's supposed to do. And if I wasn't such a big stickler against cordless, primarily just because of the idea of the batteries degrading over time, then I definitely would have kept this because it's a cool machine. But for me, I would have rather seen it go to someone who would cherish it a little bit more, since realistically, I didn't touch the thing in an entire election cycle, so it's obviously not going to be, utilized very often in my household. But the person who is going to get it hopefully will enjoy it a lot. At least that's the hope anyways. So anyways, this is Intellitech Studios signing out with my full, in-depth, although surprisingly short review, at least for me, of the Hoover Air Cordless. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, and if you do have any questions, even though by the time this video goes up it will be off to its new owner, I can still answer any questions that I may have experienced during the time that I filmed this review, so if you do have any questions, be sure to let me know. And that's pretty much that. And again, apologies for the background noise. I tried to have the window open for for a bit more airflow in here, but unfortunately there's a lot of motorcycles and people who will speed by my house, which really annoys me, and I hate living on a busy street, but that's not the point. Anyways, this is Intellitech Studios signing out. Have a good one. Peace. And let me know what review you want to see next.